December 10th, 1944. The village of Lanzerath, Belgium. The frozen earth crunched beneath combat boots as First Lieutenant Lyle Buch surveyed the ridgeline that would become his platoon's final defensive position. At 20 years old, he was one of the youngest commissioned officers in the United States Army. Yet the weight of command sat heavily on his shoulders as he studied the snow-covered fields stretching toward the German border. The Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment had just received orders that would place 18 men between the might of Nazi Germany's last desperate gamble and the road to Allied victory. None of them could have imagined that within 6 days their actions would delay an entire SS Panzer Division for nearly a full day, fundamentally altering the timeline of Hitler's Ardennes offensive and contributing to the ultimate defeat of the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans were coming. The only question was when. Buch had been born into a different world, growing up in St. Louis during the Great Depression. His family moved frequently, often living in homes with just one bedroom, no indoor plumbing and no electricity. At 14 years old, desperate to help his struggling family, he had walked into a National Guard recruitment office and enlisted in the headquarters company of the Missouri 138th Infantry Regiment. Nobody asked his age. For $1 per drill day, young Lyle Buch became a soldier. By 16, he had risen to supply sergeant, making more money than most of his civilian friends and sending it home to help feed his 4 siblings. The hardships of his childhood had forged something unbreakable in him, a resilience that would prove crucial on a frozen ridge in Belgium 4 years later. When the 35th Infantry Division was activated for federal duty on December 23, 1940, Buch found himself participating in the legendary Louisiana Maneuvers of 1941, where he excelled as transportation sergeant for the regimental headquarters company. His performance caught the attention of his superiors. After Pearl Harbor changed everything, Buch volunteered for Officer Candidate School, arriving first among several options. At Fort Benning, Georgia, he underwent 4 months of intensive training that would transform him from a capable enlisted man into a combat leader. On August 25, 1942, he graduated 4th in his class of 57 officers. The achievement earned him a position as an instructor, teaching small unit defensive tactics to the next generation of officers. He spent a full year at Fort Benning before being transferred to the 99th Infantry Division for deployment to Europe. The lessons he taught about defensive positions would soon be tested under conditions far more severe than any training scenario. The 99th Infantry Division arrived at Le Havre, France, in early November 1944. They were green troops, untested in combat, arriving at what seemed to be a quiet sector of the front. The Allied advance across Europe had been relentless since D-Day. Paris had fallen in August, Brussels in September, Antwerp shortly after. The momentum seemed unstoppable. The Ardennes region of Belgium, with its dense forests and difficult terrain, was considered a rest area, a place to season new divisions before committing them to major operations. By mid-November, the 99th had relieved the veteran 60th Regiment of the 9th Infantry Division in the Ardennes. The sector was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Buch took command of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon attached to the 394th Infantry Regiment. This was an elite unit within the regiment, consisting of soldiers selected because they were expert marksmen and in peak physical condition. Some had been college students before the war, members of the Army Specialized Training Program, before it was abruptly terminated to provide infantry replacements. The platoon normally consisted of 25 men organized into 2 9-man reconnaissance squads and a 7-man headquarters section. Their mission was clear but dangerous: conduct reconnaissance patrols up to and through German lines, capture enemy soldiers for intelligence, fix enemy positions, and serve as the eyes and ears of the regimental commander. They were not trained for sustained combat. They were scouts, spies in uniform, meant to gather information and fade back into the shadows. For the next few weeks, the platoon established observation posts and conducted dangerous patrols behind enemy lines. They crept through snow-clogged terrain obscured by fog, sometimes penetrating as far as Losheim, 2 miles behind German positions. On these missions, they captured German soldiers and brought them back for interrogation. The work was terrifying, but essential. Buch and several of his men were among the first in the regiment to earn the Combat Infantryman Badge, awarded for exemplary conduct in ground combat. Despite the risks, casualties had been light. The German forces opposite them appeared content to man their positions along the Siegfried Line without aggressive action. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were exhausted, their combat power spent after years of fighting on multiple fronts. On December 10th, everything changed. Major Robert Kriz, commanding officer of the 394th Infantry Regiment, called Buch to regimental headquarters with new orders. The platoon was to move immediately to positions near the village of Lanzerath, approximately 6 miles southeast of their current location at Hunningen. Lanzerath was a tiny hamlet of just 23 homes and a church, sitting at a critical road junction in the northern part of the Losheim Gap. This 5-mile gap between the 99th Infantry Division to the north and the 106th Infantry Division to the south represented a significant vulnerability in the American defensive line. Intelligence had noted increased German activity in the area. The platoon was being sent to plug the gap and provide early warning of any enemy movement. Behind them lay roads that could give German forces rapid access to the American rear, potentially allowing them to flank the thinly deployed divisions defending this sector. As Buch studied his maps, the magnitude of the assignment became clear. His platoon, nominally consisting of 25 men but currently reduced to just 18 because some were detailed to regimental operations, was being asked to defend a 5-mile gap in the front line. The only reserve was the 3rd Battalion of the 394th Regiment, stationed at Buchholz Station several miles to the rear. If the Germans came through Lanzerath in strength, his 18 men would be alone. The tactical situation was even more complex than it appeared. The Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon would be attached to Task Force X, a small unit from the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion consisting of 55 men with 4 towed 3-inch guns. Additionally, 22 men from the 820th 2nd Reconnaissance Platoon, mounted on an armoured half-track and 2 jeeps, would be positioned in the village itself. On paper, this seemed like a reasonable defensive force. In reality, the units had never trained together and lacked unified command. The platoon arrived at Lanzerath on December 10th and immediately began fortifying their position. Buch selected a ridgeline northwest of the village, a wooded crest that overlooked a gently sloping field leading down to the road connecting Lanzerath to the east. The position offered excellent fields of fire across open ground. The men dug foxholes along the woodline, spacing them to provide interlocking fire. Each position was carefully concealed, with camouflage and overhead cover to protect against artillery. The snow that had fallen in recent days provided additional concealment, making their positions nearly invisible from the open field below. They positioned their weapons with calculated precision. 2.30 caliber machine guns covered the main approaches. Buch had personally procured a jeep-mounted .50 caliber heavy machine gun, an impressive weapon that could tear through enemy formations at long range. This heavy weapon was positioned in defilade, able to interdict reinforcements approaching from the south, while remaining protected from direct fire. The platoon zeroed all weapons on a farm fence that bisected the field approximately 100 yards from their position, creating a predetermined kill zone. The men set tripwires connected to empty cans filled with rocks to detect infiltrators attempting to approach through the woods at night. They established communications with battalion headquarters at Losheimer Graben via telephone landline and maintained radio contact with regimental headquarters at Hunningen. Patrols were sent into Lanzerath itself to coordinate with Task Force X and the reconnaissance platoon positioned there. The men of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon settled into their frozen foxholes and waited. The temperature dropped well below freezing. A bitter wind swept across the ridge, interspersed with periods of snowfall. 4 to 5 inches of snow blanketed the position, further camouflaging their foxholes. The cold was brutal, but the men endured. They were young, most in their late teens or early 20s, far from home, defending a ridge in Belgium that few of them could have found on a map before the war. For 5 days they watched and waited. German activity across the border increased noticeably. On the night of December 15th, Buch and his men heard the rumble of vehicles moving in the darkness to the east. Something was building. Reports came in from other units of unusual enemy movements. The Germans were bringing up reinforcements, massing forces along the Siegfried Line. American commanders noted the activity, but interpreted it as defensive preparations, expecting a German response to the ongoing American attack toward the Roer River dams further north. The possibility of a major German offensive seemed remote. The Wehrmacht was beaten, its strength depleted, its resources exhausted. Or so American intelligence believed. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 1944, the world exploded. A massive artillery barrage erupted along an 80-mile front as 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment was the opening move of Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last great gamble in the West. The objective was breathtaking in its ambition: break through the American lines in the Ardennes, drive to the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace that would allow Germany to concentrate all its remaining strength against the Soviet Union. For this offensive, Hitler had scraped together his last reserves. 3 entire armies, including elite SS panzer divisions that had been refitted and reinforced, would smash through what Hitler believed was a weak sector of the American line held by inexperienced troops. The artillery barrage lasted 90 minutes. Shells crashed down across the entire front, targeting command posts, communication lines, and forward positions. The men of Buch's platoon huddled in their foxholes as the forest around them erupted in explosions. Tree branches shattered and fell. The concussion of near misses hammered their bodies. The frozen ground shook with each detonation. Yet remarkably, the barrage was not particularly effective against their well-prepared positions on the ridge. The Germans were firing blind, unable to pinpoint the exact location of the American foxholes. When the barrage lifted at 7 o'clock, the men emerged from their holes shaken but unharmed. The telephone line to battalion headquarters had been severed, but their radio still functioned. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, the platoon watched in growing alarm as Task Force X withdrew from Lanzerath. The tank destroyers and reconnaissance unit, which had been their primary support, pulled back without explanation and without informing Buch. His platoon was now completely alone, the only American unit between the German border and the rear areas of the 99th Infantry Division. Through the early morning mist, Buch observed movement to the east. Soldiers were forming up, hundreds of them, far more than his intelligence briefings had suggested were in the area. He radioed regimental headquarters and requested permission to withdraw, to conduct a fighting retreat and delay the enemy while preserving his force. The response came back immediately and unequivocally. Remain in position. Reinforcements from the 3rd Battalion would come forward to support them. Hold at all costs. At approximately 8 o'clock, 3 men from the platoon, Sergeant William Slape, Private James Silvola, and Technician 5th Grade Sam Jenkins, moved down to establish an observation post in a house on the eastern edge of Lanzerath that had been abandoned by Task Force X. Buch accompanied them to make a final assessment of the situation. What he saw through the early morning light made his blood run cold. A column of approximately 500 German soldiers was marching toward Lanzerath from the direction of Lossheim. Their distinctive helmet silhouette identified them as Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, among the elite troops Germany could still field. These were not the exhausted, demoralized soldiers that American intelligence had described. These were combat veterans, moving with discipline and purpose, advancing to exploit what they believed would be a clean breakthrough of American lines. Book and the observation team scrambled back to the ridge and alerted the platoon. 500 German paratroopers against 18 American soldiers. The odds were approximately 28-1. Everything in Book's training told him to withdraw, to avoid decisive engagement against such overwhelming force. But his orders were explicit: hold at all costs. The German column reached Lanzerath and began moving through the village. An elderly Belgian woman, frightened by the arrival of German troops, approached a group of German officers gathered near a café. She spoke to them, gesturing toward the ridge where the American positions were concealed. Whether she intentionally betrayed the American location or was simply trying to protect her village from destruction remains unknown. What is certain is that the information reached the German commander, who immediately began deploying his battalion for an assault on the American position. At approximately 10 o'clock, the first wave of German paratroopers emerged from Lanzerath and began advancing up the snow-covered slope toward the American foxholes. They moved in textbook infantry assault formation, spread out in extended lines, weapons at the ready. The morning sun reflected off the fresh snow, creating brilliant illumination across the battlefield. The Germans could see the woodline clearly, but had no indication of the exact location of American positions. They advanced confidently, expecting light resistance, if any at all. Buck watched them come, waiting for the perfect moment. His men lay silent in their camouflaged foxholes, weapons aimed at the fence line they had zeroed days before. The Germans crossed the fence, continuing their advance. 100 yards, 90 yards, 80 yards. At approximately 75 yards, Bauck gave the command that would begin one of the most remarkable defensive stands in American military history. The American position erupted in fire. 2.30 caliber machine guns opened up simultaneously, their interlocking fields of fire creating a wall of lead across the snow-covered slope. M1 rifles cracked with devastating accuracy as the expert marksmen of the platoon engaged individual targets. The effect was catastrophic. German paratroopers fell in windows, cut down by the precise, disciplined fire. The fence line that the Germans had just crossed became a killing zone. Men tried to take cover behind it, but the wooden fence provided no protection against rifle bullets. The 50 caliber machine gun joined the fight, its heavy slugs capable of penetrating multiple targets. The distinctive sound of the big weapon echoed across the valley like a giant tearing canvas. The first German assault lasted only minutes before the survivors retreated back toward Lanzerath, leaving behind dozens of dead and wounded scattered across the snow. The Americans had suffered no casualties. The shock of the ambush had been complete. The German battalion commander, assessing his casualties and the strength of the position that had just destroyed his assault wave, made the reasonable but incorrect assumption that he was facing a much larger American force, possibly a full company with heavy weapons support. He decided to try again, this time with better fire support. Artillery and mortar fire began falling on the American position as the Germans prepared for a second assault. Around noon, the second wave came. More German paratroopers emerged from Lanzerath, this time moving more cautiously, using available cover, providing suppressing fire as they advanced. The American position again erupted in defensive fire. The machine guns traversed across the attacking formations. The riflemen picked individual targets with the precision that had earned them selection for the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. The 50 caliber machine gun hammered away at groups of Germans attempting to mass for a rush on the American positions. Again, the attack broke against the disciplined fire of the defenders. German casualties mounted. The snow across the field became stained with blood. Bodies lay where they had fallen, testimony to the accuracy of American marksmanship. The Germans pulled back again, but this time they maintained pressure with sustained fire. Machine guns positioned in Lanzerath raked the American wood line. Mortars continued to fall, seeking to destroy or suppress the defenders. The situation was becoming critical. Ammunition was being expended at an alarming rate. Several men had been wounded by shell fragments. The Germans were learning the position's layout with each assault. It was only a matter of time before they found the flanks and enveloped the position. Book radioed regimental headquarters again, reporting the situation and again requesting permission to withdraw before being surrounded. Again, the order came back, "Hold your position. Reinforcements are coming." Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Germans launched their third major assault. This time they committed additional forces, attacking with even greater determination. The American defenders poured fire into the advancing Germans, but the sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. Private Billy Queen, one of the 4 forward artillery observers who had attached themselves to the platoon, was manning a position when a German bullet struck him in the stomach. He cried out and collapsed. Without a medic or surgical equipment, there was nothing his comrades could do except make him comfortable. Queen died within minutes, the only American fatality of the day-long battle. Sergeant William Slape took over the .50 caliber machine gun as the third assault reached its peak. He fired burst after burst into the German formations, the heavy weapon bucking against its mount. He fired so continuously that the barrel began to glow red-hot. The gun started firing on its own as the heat set off rounds in the chamber. Then, catastrophically, the barrel warped from the extreme heat and the weapon jammed. The platoon's most powerful weapon was out of action at the height of the battle. Despite this loss, the third German assault also broke against the American position. The paratroopers retreated again, having suffered even more casualties. The field in front of the American foxholes was carpeted with German dead and wounded. The German battalion commander was now in a desperate situation. His unit had suffered at least 92 confirmed casualties, decimating his effective strength. He was supposed to have cleared this route hours ago, allowing follow-on forces to exploit the breakthrough. Instead, he was bogged down against what he still believed was a large American force. He decided to halt further frontal assaults and instead probe for the flanks of the American position while maintaining pressure with fire. As dusk approached, the situation for the Americans became untenable. They had been fighting for nearly 10 hours with no relief. Ammunition was critically low. Most of the men were wounded to varying degrees. Communication with higher headquarters had been lost. The .50 caliber was destroyed. The Germans were finally moving to flank the position rather than continue futile frontal assaults. As dusk approached, German paratroopers finally succeeded in working around the American flanks. Groups of approximately 50 German soldiers penetrated the perimeter from multiple directions. The Americans fought hand-to-hand in some foxholes, but the outcome was inevitable. The Germans moved systematically from position to position, overwhelming each foxhole in turn. A German soldier fired into Book's position, hitting the lieutenant in the leg and seriously wounding the man sharing his foxhole. Book was captured at gunpoint. Within minutes, the entire platoon had been overrun. 15 men were taken prisoner on the spot. 2 others, Privates Jenkins and Preston, had been sent earlier in the day to regimental headquarters to summon reinforcements. They would be captured the following day. 3 men, Robinson, McGeehee and Silvola, had been cut off earlier and escaped toward Losheimer Graben, eventually reaching American lines. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge was over. The 18 men of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, supported by 4 forward artillery observers, had held off an entire German battalion of approximately 500 paratroopers for nearly a full day. They had inflicted 92 confirmed casualties while suffering only 1 killed and 14 wounded before finally being overwhelmed. More importantly, they had achieved something far more significant than simple casualties. They had delayed the entire German offensive in the northern sector for nearly 20 hours. As the captured Americans were assembled in Lanzerath, treated for their wounds by German medical personnel who had set up aid stations in village homes, the full implications of the day's fight began to unfold. The German 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, bloodied and exhausted from their battles against the tiny American force, made no attempt to continue the advance that night. They had suffered severe casualties, and their commander feared that the woods beyond Lanzerath were filled with more American troops and possibly tanks. The cautious decision to halt and consolidate rather than push forward into the darkness would have cascading effects on the entire German offensive. Around midnight, nearly 12 hours behind schedule, a column of German armour finally arrived in Lanzerath. This was Kampfgruppe Peiper, the most powerful armoured formation in the entire German offensive. Led by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, this battle group consisted of approximately 4,800 men and 800 vehicles, including 117 tanks among them, the fearsome Tiger and King Tiger heavy tanks. Peiper's mission was critical to the success of the entire operation. He was to drive to the Meuse River, seize the bridges, and hold them for following forces. Speed was everything. The timetable called for him to reach the Meuse on the first day. Instead, he found himself stuck behind a demoralized parachute regiment that had spent the entire day fighting a platoon-sized force. Peiper was furious. He confronted Oberst Helmut von Hoffmann, commander of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, in a heated argument witnessed by American prisoners. Peiper demanded to know why the regiment had stopped, why they had not cleared the route forward, why they had not scouted the woods beyond Lanzerath to determine if additional American forces were present. Hoffmann, outranked by the SS officer despite his higher formal rank, tried to explain that his regiment had taken severe casualties, that the Americans had been stronger than expected, that his men needed rest. Peiper was unimpressed. He personally led a reconnaissance forward with his own troops and discovered that the woods were empty. The American force that had held up the German timetable for an entire day had been just 18 men. By the time this truth was discovered and Kampfgruppe Peiper resumed its advance, it was 4:30 on the morning of December 17th, more than 18 hours behind schedule. This delay would prove catastrophic to German plans. The rigid timetable of the offensive required precise coordination. Delayed units created traffic jams on the narrow roads. Follow-on forces piled up behind the bottleneck at Lanzerath. American commanders, initially surprised by the offensive, used the precious hours bought by units like Buch's platoon to rush reinforcements to threatened sectors. The 1st Infantry Division, the 2nd Infantry Division, elements of the 7th Armoured Division, and eventually the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions all moved into blocking positions. By the time Kampfgruppe Peiper finally broke free and advanced toward the Meuse, they found their route increasingly contested. Peiper's battle group did achieve remarkable success in the initial days of the offensive. They overran American positions at Honsfeld and Büllingen, capturing vital fuel supplies. On December 17th, near the Beaugnies crossroads, elements of Peiper's command committed one of the war's most notorious atrocities, massacring approximately 84 American prisoners of war in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. The battle group pressed on toward Stavelot, crossing the Amblev River on December 18th, driving deeper into American-held territory. For a brief moment, it seemed Peiper might actually reach his objective. But the 18-hour delay at Lanzerath had given American forces time to react. Elements of the 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, and the 3rd Armoured Division converged on Peiper's route. Blown bridges forced detours. American tank destroyers ambushed German columns. Fighter bombers, grounded by weather on December 16th, returned to the skies and hammered the exposed German armour. By December 22nd, Kampfgruppe Peiper found itself surrounded in the small town of La Glaise, cut off from supplies, nearly out of fuel and ammunition. The once mighty battle group that had begun the offensive with 4,800 men and 117 tanks was reduced to approximately 800 men with no operational armour. On the night of December 23rd, Piper ordered his remaining men to abandon all vehicles and equipment and escape on foot back to German lines. They left behind more than 100 vehicles, including 6 King Tiger tanks in La Glaise. The spearhead of the German 6th Panzer Army had been stopped. The breakthrough that was supposed to reach Antwerp had gotten less than halfway to the Meuse River. The carefully crafted timetable, disrupted on the very first day by 18 American soldiers on a frozen ridge, never recovered. Meanwhile, the captured members of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon began their own ordeal. The men who could walk were marched east toward Germany. Those too seriously wounded to move were left in German field hospitals. After 2 days of walking through bitter cold, the prisoners were loaded into a railroad boxcar at the village of Jünkerath. Boak found himself crammed into a single cattle car with 71 other American POWs. They travelled for days without food or water. By Christmas Day, 7 men in Book's car had died, and the rest were barely clinging to life. Eventually, the prisoners were transported to hospitals in Frankfurt and Hanover for treatment of their wounds. From there, they were sent to POW camps, where they would remain for the next 5 months until liberated by Allied forces in April 1945. Lieutenant Book considered the outcome of December 16th a complete failure. His unit had been overrun. Most of his men had been wounded. All had been captured. The mission to hold the position had ended with the position being lost. He had no way of knowing that his platoon had accomplished something far more significant than simply holding ground. Due to lost communications and the chaos of the offensive's opening days, American commanders had no immediate knowledge of what the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon had achieved. The unit's actions were lost in the confusion of the broader battle. When the war ended and the prisoners were finally freed, most of the platoon's members just wanted to go home. They were tired, wounded, traumatized by months of captivity in disease-infested POW camps. The last thing they wanted was attention or recognition. It was only gradually, in the years after the war, that the full significance of the Battle of Lanzerath Ridge began to emerge. Historians examining German after-action reports discovered that the 18-hour delay caused by resistance at Lanzerath had fundamentally disrupted the timetable of the 6th Panzer Army. The task of defeating the 99th Infantry Division had been assigned to the 12th SS Panzer Division, reinforced by additional units. Despite more than 10 days of intense fighting, the 12th SS Panzer Division was never able to dislodge American forces from Elsenborn Ridge, where elements of the 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions had established a defensive line. The northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge became a sticking point for the entire German offensive. Had the initial breakthrough occurred on schedule, German forces might have overrun the massive American supply depots around Liège and Spa, fundamentally changing the course of the battle. The men of the platoon gradually learned what they had accomplished. In June 1966, to Book's surprise, a Silver Star medal arrived in his mailbox with no ceremony or explanation. No other members of the platoon received recognition, which upset Book deeply. Shortly afterward, he was interviewed by John S. D. Eisenhower for the book The Bitter Woods, which described the platoon's actions in detail. Eisenhower, who later became ambassador to Belgium, hosted Book and other platoon members when they visited Lanzerath in December 1969. The village had been rebuilt after the war, and the Belgians welcomed the American veterans who had fought to protect their country. One platoon member, whose wounds particularly troubled him, was William James, whose real name was Tsakanikas. He endured 37 operations attempting to repair the damage from his combat wounds, before dying from complications on June 22, 1977. Columnist Jack Anderson learned of James's story and launched a campaign to have him posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The campaign brought national attention to the platoon's actions for the first time. Congressional hearings were held to examine whether the platoon deserved greater recognition. The hearings resulted in a recommendation that James receive the Medal of Honor, and remarkably, Congress passed Public Law 96-145, signed by President Jimmy Carter on December 14, 1979, which specifically waived the normal time limitations exclusively for members of the 394th Infantry Regiment's Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon. The Army and Air Force concurred with the Medal of Honor recommendation, but the Marine Corps, which had to approve all such awards, responded that James had failed to show sufficient intrepidity to merit the nation's highest decoration. The decision was controversial and remains so to this day. Nevertheless, the congressional attention led to a comprehensive review of the platoon's actions. On October 26, 1981, 36 years after the battle, the members of the platoon finally received formal recognition for their valour. 14 of the original 18 were present at a ceremony at Fort Myer, Virginia, hosted by Secretary of the Army John O. Marsh. The decorations were extraordinary. 4 members, including Lieutenant Book, received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest decoration for valour. 5 members received the Silver Star. 9 members received the Bronze Star with V device for valour. The entire platoon was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, recognizing them collectively as a unit. These decorations made the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment the most decorated American platoon of its size for a single action in World War II. The ceremony in 1981 finally gave the men the recognition they had earned decades earlier. Book, by then a successful chiropractor, spoke emotionally about his men and their sacrifice. He maintained that the real heroes were those who had fought beside him, particularly those like Billy Queen who had given their lives, and William James whose wounds had ultimately killed him years after the battle. The recognition meant everything to the veterans. For nearly 4 decades, they had carried the belief that they had failed, that their capture represented a defeat. Now, finally, they understood that their desperate stand on a frozen ridge had contributed materially to Allied victory in one of the war's most critical battles. The Belgian government unveiled an official monument at the Lanzerath Ridge site on May 12, 2005. The memorial, a simple but dignified stone marker, honours all who fought there on December 16, 1944. The inscription notes that 18 American soldiers held this position against 500 German paratroopers, delaying the advance of an entire SS Panzer division and contributing to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. The monument has become a pilgrimage site for military historians and veterans' families. Each year on December 16th, a small ceremony is held to remember the battle. Belgian schoolchildren learn about what happened on the ridge overlooking their village. The story of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon has become part of the local heritage. Lyle Book lived to see all of this recognition. He married, raised a family, and built a successful career as a chiropractor, practicing from 1949 until his retirement in 1997. He never spoke much about the war until late in life, when he finally began sharing his experiences with historians and researchers. He maintained contact with the surviving members of his platoon, attending reunions and memorial services. When fellow platoon members passed away, Book would often deliver eulogies, speaking about their courage and sacrifice. He lobbied tirelessly for recognition not for himself, but for his men. The decorations that finally came in 1981 were the result of years of letter-writing campaigns, congressional testimony, and persistent advocacy by Book on behalf of his soldiers. On December 2, 2016, First Lieutenant Lyle Book died of pneumonia at the age of 92, just days before his 93rd birthday. He was the last surviving officer of the platoon. His death was noted in military publications and newspapers around the country. The New York Times published a substantial obituary recognizing his role in one of World War II's most remarkable defensive stands. Veterans organizations honored his memory. The surviving members of the 99th Infantry Division held memorial services. He was buried with full military honors. In his eulogy, speakers noted that Book had spent his final decades ensuring that his men received the recognition they deserved, never seeking attention for himself, always directing credit to those who had served under his command. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge stands as one of the most remarkable small unit actions in American military history. 18 soldiers, led by a 20-year-old lieutenant, held off 500 enemy troops for nearly a full day, inflicting 92 confirmed casualties while suffering only 1 killed and 14 wounded before finally being overwhelmed. More significantly, they delayed the advance of the entire German 6th Panzer Army for 18 critical hours at the opening of Germany's last major offensive in the West. The delay allowed American forces to respond to the surprise attack, to rush reinforcements to threatened sectors, to establish defensive lines that would ultimately contain and defeat the German breakthrough. The mathematics of the battle are straightforward. The German offensive required precise adherence to a rigid timetable. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the assault, was supposed to reach the Meuse River on December 16th. Instead, they were stuck behind a parachute regiment that had spent an entire day fighting what they believed was a large American force, but was actually just 18 men. When Peiper finally got moving on the morning of December 17th, he was 18 hours behind schedule. He never made up that time. American reinforcements reached blocking positions before he could break through. The fuel he needed was destroyed or captured by American forces who had time to react because of the delay. The bridges he needed to cross were blown by American engineers who had time to prepare because of the delay. The air support that would eventually destroy his battle group was able to take off and find targets because of the delay. Every hour that Buch's platoon held that ridge gave American commanders time to respond to the crisis. The 1st Infantry Division had time to move into position. The 2nd Infantry Division had time to establish defences on Elsenborn Ridge. The 7th Armoured Division had time to reach St. Vith. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had time to deploy to Verbermont and Bastogne. All of these movements, critical to containing the German breakthrough, were made possible by the time bought by small unit actions like the stand at Lanzerath. Military historians have calculated that if the German timetable had been maintained, if Kampfgruppe Peiper had reached the Meuse on schedule, the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge might have been very different. The Allies would still likely have won, but at a far higher cost in casualties and time. The story of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon resonates because it embodies fundamental military virtues. 18 young men, vastly outnumbered, facing overwhelming odds, chose to stand and fight rather than retreat. They followed orders to hold their position, even when those orders seemed to require the impossible. They fought with skill and courage throughout a day-long battle, inflicting disproportionate casualties on a numerically superior enemy. They maintained unit cohesion and discipline under extreme pressure. When finally overwhelmed, they surrendered with honour, having accomplished far more than anyone had a right to expect. Their story demonstrates that in war, small units in the right place at the right time can have strategic effects far beyond their size. The platoon's action also illustrates the importance of leadership at the small unit level. Lieutenant Buch was 20 years old, one of the youngest officers in the army, commanding men who were in many cases older than he was. Yet his leadership throughout the battle was exemplary. He positioned his unit wisely, using terrain to maximum advantage. He maintained fire discipline, waiting for the perfect moment to spring the ambush. He directed fire effectively during the battle, ensuring that weapons supported each other. He communicated with higher headquarters, attempting to provide them with accurate intelligence about the situation. When ordered to hold despite impossible odds, he transmitted that order to his men and they obeyed. His personal courage under fire, moving between positions during the battle, encouraged his soldiers. When finally wounded and captured, his first concern was for his men. The men of the platoon were equally remarkable. They were expert marksmen who had been selected for the intelligence and reconnaissance role because of their superior skills. During the battle, that expertise showed. Each burst from their machine guns, each shot from their rifles was aimed and effective. They did not panic fire or waste ammunition. They maintained their positions despite artillery fire, despite being wounded, despite watching Billy Queen die, despite knowing they were massively outnumbered with no hope of reinforcement. The discipline and courage they displayed was extraordinary. These were not hardened combat veterans. The 99th Infantry Division was green, newly arrived in Europe, untested in battle. Yet when the moment came, these young men fought like seasoned professionals. The German forces that opposed them were no slouches. The 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division were paratroopers, elite troops even by German standards. They had combat experience from earlier campaigns. They outnumbered the Americans approximately 28-1. They had artillery and mortar support. They should have overrun the American position in the first assault. That they failed to do so for nearly a full day speaks to both the skill of the defenders and the advantages of prepared defensive positions occupied by disciplined troops. The Germans showed courage in continuing to attack, despite mounting casualties. Their battalion commander showed tactical competence in eventually probing for the flanks rather than continuing futile frontal assaults. But by the time they succeeded in overwhelming the position, they had suffered casualties that effectively destroyed their unit as an effective fighting force. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge also demonstrated the fog of war and its effects on military operations. American commanders had no idea what Buch's platoon was accomplishing because communications were cut. The platoon fought in isolation, unaware that their resistance was having strategic effects. When they were finally overrun and captured, Lieutenant Buch believed he had failed. The mission had been to hold the position, and the position had been lost. He carried that sense of failure for decades. Similarly, German commanders were operating with incomplete information. The battalion commander attacking the ridge believed he was facing a much larger force, probably a full company with heavy weapons. That belief led to cautious tactics and the decision to halt the advance after dark. The German High Command had no real-time understanding of why their timetable was falling apart on the first day. Only after the battle, when historians could examine records from both sides, did the full picture emerge. The treatment of the captured Americans by their German captors was generally correct, following the Geneva Conventions. The Germans provided medical treatment to the wounded in aid stations set up in Lanzerath homes. They allowed the prisoners to receive treatment before being marched to the rear. This stands in stark contrast to the Malmedy massacre that occurred the following day when elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper murdered American prisoners. The difference highlights that war crimes were not universal German practice, but were often unit-specific, reflecting the leadership and character of particular commanders. The paratroopers who captured Buch's platoon were professional soldiers who followed the rules of war. Peiper's SS troops, by contrast, committed one of the war's most notorious atrocities. The prisoner of war experience of the platoon members was harrowing. Crammed into cattle cars without food or water, watching fellow prisoners die from exposure and dehydration, spending months in disease-infested camps with inadequate food and medical care, the men suffered tremendously. Several nearly died from their wounds and the conditions of captivity. When finally liberated in April 1945, they were skeletal, ill, traumatized. Many carried physical and psychological wounds from their captivity for the rest of their lives. William James endured decades of surgeries attempting to repair damage from his combat wounds before finally succumbing to complications. These men paid a heavy price for their service. The delayed recognition of the platoon's actions points to a systemic problem in military awards and decorations. The chaos of combat, particularly in a confused situation like the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, meant that many acts of valor went unrecognized. When units were overrun or captured, their accomplishments were often lost in the fog of war. The fact that it took 36 years for Buch's platoon to receive proper recognition is a testament to the inadequacy of the system. Only through persistent advocacy by Lieutenant Buch, coverage by journalists like Jack Anderson, congressional hearings, and eventually special legislation did these men finally receive the decorations they had earned in 1944. How many other similar stories were never documented, never recognized, lost to history? The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge has been the subject of numerous books, articles, and documentaries. Alex Kershaw's The Longest Winter provided the most comprehensive account of the battle and brought the story to a wider audience. The book became a New York Times bestseller, introducing a new generation to the story of 18 soldiers who changed history. Military historians continue to study the battle as an example of successful small-unit defensive tactics. The platoon's action is now taught at military academies as a case study in leadership, tactics, and the importance of individual small-unit actions in shaping larger campaigns. The lessons of Lanzerath remain relevant for modern military forces. The importance of well-trained soldiers who can operate independently when communications are lost. The value of junior officers who can make tactical decisions without constant guidance from higher headquarters. The advantage of prepared defensive positions occupied by disciplined troops. The multiplier effect of accurate marksmanship and effective use of terrain. The courage required to stand and fight when vastly outnumbered. These principles transcend time and technology. They were true in 1944 and remain true today. Modern military training emphasizes decentralized decision-making, small-unit leadership, and the empowerment of junior leaders. The stand at Lanzerath demonstrates why these principles matter. The story also illustrates the human dimension of war. These were not superhuman warriors, but ordinary young men who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. Lyle Book had enlisted at 14 to help his family during the Depression. Many of his men had been college students before the war. They came from all walks of American life, brought together by the draft and the needs of national defense. When the moment came, they performed heroically, not because they were special, but because they were well-trained, well-led, and committed to their mission and to each other. The bonds formed in combat are among the strongest human connections. The men of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon remained close for the rest of their lives, attending reunions, maintaining correspondence, supporting each other through the challenges of post-war life. The Belgian people who lived through the battle and witnessed what the Americans did for their country never forgot. For decades after the war, local residents maintained contact with platoon members, sending letters, hosting visits, ensuring that the sacrifice was remembered. When the monument was dedicated in 2005, 3 generations of Belgian families attended to honour the men who had fought to protect their village. This relationship between liberators and liberated is one of the enduring legacies of World War II. The Americans who fought in Europe were not conquerors, but liberators, and the people they freed remembered and honoured that sacrifice. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge stands as a testament to a fundamental truth about warfare. Victory in war is not determined solely by the largest battles or the most famous generals. It is also determined by the cumulative effect of thousands of small actions, many of them by obscure units whose names will never be widely known. 18 soldiers holding a ridge for a day, a squad holding a bridge for an hour, a platoon defending a crossroads for a night. Each of these small actions, multiplied across a theatre of war, shapes the outcome of campaigns. The men who fight these small battles often do not know the strategic significance of their actions. They simply do their duty, follow their orders, support their comrades. In doing so, they change history. Lieutenant Book and his men did not set out to become heroes. They were given an impossible mission, and they did their best to accomplish it. They held their position as long as humanly possible. When finally overwhelmed, they had achieved something remarkable. 92 German casualties inflicted, 18 hours of delay imposed on the enemy's timetable, one of the most decorated small unit actions in American military history. They demonstrated that courage, skill, and leadership at the tactical level can have strategic effects. They proved that ordinary Americans, when properly trained and led, are capable of extraordinary accomplishments. They showed that even in defeat, even in capture, even in failure by traditional military measures, a unit can achieve victory by the measure that ultimately matters, contributing to the success of the overall mission. As the years pass and the veterans of World War II leave us, it becomes increasingly important to preserve and share their stories. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge is not just a tale of military tactics and strategic outcomes. It is a story of human courage, of young men who stood when it would have been easier to run, who fought when it would have been safer to surrender, who endured suffering and captivity with dignity and honour. It is a story that needs to be told to each new generation so that they understand the price of freedom, the cost of victory, the debt we owe to those who came before. On December 16th each year, ceremonies are held at the monument on Lanzerath Ridge. Wreaths are laid, speeches are given. The names of the platoon members are read aloud. Belgian schoolchildren learn about what happened on that frozen ridge decades ago. American veterans and military personnel visit to pay respects. The ritual of remembrance continues, ensuring that the sacrifice is not forgotten, that the story endures. As long as we remember what 18 American soldiers accomplished on that December day in 1944, their legacy lives on. They bought precious time with their courage. They delayed an enemy offensive with their skill. They upheld their nation's honor with their sacrifice. They embodied the best traditions of American military service. The story of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment reminds us that in the great sweep of history, individual actions matter. 18 men changed the course of a battle. Their delay of the German advance contributed to the ultimate Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge. That victory shortened the war, saved countless lives, helped preserve freedom in Western Europe. The line from their foxholes on a Belgian ridge to the world we live in today is direct and clear. We are the beneficiaries of their courage. We enjoy freedom because they were willing to stand. We live in peace because they were willing to fight. We owe them a debt that can never be fully repaid, but we can honour it by remembering their story, by teaching it to our children, by ensuring that their names and their deeds are never forgotten. First Lieutenant Lyle Book and the men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon did not fail on December 16, 1944. They succeeded beyond measure. They held a position they were ordered to hold for as long as any unit could have held it. They inflicted casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. They delayed a major enemy offensive at a critical moment. They demonstrated that Americans, even when vastly outnumbered, even when cut off and isolated, even when facing the most elite troops Germany could field, would stand and fight with skill and courage. Their story deserves to be remembered alongside the more famous battles and heroes of World War II. They were ordinary men who did extraordinary things when their country needed them most. That is the definition of heroism. That is the legacy of Lanzerath Ridge.